We're not too big for our boots. I think we just have these expectations about ourselves that no one else has. 99% of the world would desire what we've got. Well, if you kind of look around the world and go, what city of 2 million people is a world leader in anything?
Welcome back to Tech Society TV. I'm Alex.
And I'm John.
And today we're talking with Mark Pownall, Director of Strategy and Innovation at Business News. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Pleasure.
Let's just jump right in.
Go for it, mate.
So you have more than 30 years of experience in newspapers, broadcast and digital media in Perth and London.
Yeah.
So did you start your career here in Perth or you ended up in Perth?
I did. Look, I throw in the and London bit. I mean, honestly, I started here. I got a cadetship at the West Australian, which was, moderately difficult to get.
Yeah.
It was probably the last bastion of that type of thing. I think there were 14 cadets in the year that they took me. After that, it drifted off to 5, 6 to 0. So it was very much the beginning of the end of that style. And after working at the West Australian for a few years, I went to London as a backpacker, probably not even thinking about being a journalist, to be honest. But when you got to a place like London, you worked your strengths, and I ended up in the financial press because I'd worked in business at the West Australian, and I really loved it. And I've got a sort of new lease of life in journalism there because it's very competitive. And that was... here we had the West Australian covering business and pretty much nothing else. Whereas in London, I was working for one of 4 competitors just chasing after news about financial advisors. So it was great fun. I mean, I really enjoyed that.
So now you're with Business News. Did you jump right into Business News when you came back from London, or what was the...
No, the nature of it is that I came back and ended up at the West Australian again because there weren't that many options. And I did actually put a toe in the water of public relations for a year or so in the 90s. It wasn't for me, and maybe I just, maybe it was too early, maybe it was the wrong place, maybe it was the wrong type of clients. I don't really know, but it didn't fit me. And I ended up back at the West Australian again. And then eventually I got approached by Business News, which was very much in those days a bit of a community newspaper for the city, but it had some new owners and they had a few plans and they were keen to get some people with experience there. And I was the first person they got over as editor, as it turned out. So, look, it was a lucky moment, I think, for me. I've been there 20 years now. So that seems like a really long time, given I'd never really stuck at any job for more than 3 years prior to that. But I tell everybody I've worked for 4 different companies in 20 years because it's been markedly different segments of that part of it.
Was there quite a big culture shift between jumping from West Australian over to Business News?
Yeah, look, I don't think you could get more marked. You've got what is essentially pretty big... the West Australian was a pretty big business. Yeah. It had a pretty large, you're struggling to see the other end of the floor for the journalists. We were out in Osborne Park and we were, I knew one of the advertising reps who used to wander up to our floor, and I met the management a little bit because we're in business. We kind of met the senior management occasionally, but generally speaking, you wouldn't have that much interaction. So you go to a small business like Business News, which in those days was quite a bit smaller than it is now, but still, we're still a small business now. And, we're tucked away in some corner in Northbridge in a, windowless office. But having said that, oddly enough, we had those very funky Apple Mac, the ones with the coloured backgrounds. We had those on the desks. And we had email on our own computers, which I did not have at the West Australian when I left. Wow. The West Australian, you had big word processors with black screens and green writing, and they had just engineered text email could come through.
So what year was this?
2000.
Wow.
So we had an email console somewhere in the corner.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, to be fair, the West Australian had a version of email when I joined in 1990, you could speak to each of the bureaus directly via text in 1990. So I knew kind of what email was, but I didn't. But the ability to receive a personal email, download, whatever documentation people could send in 2000. There was a bit of stuff you could send around. Most of it was fairly rude stuff from recollection. But, to me, that was a really odd thing that I left a big company with the big modern presses and these, and pretty much kitted out to be the, state of the art in newspapers. And yet this little business had the email and the internet there on my screen.
And that leads pretty well into what you're doing for Business News now. You're the director of strategy and innovation.
Yeah.
So
fancy title that,
Yeah, what does that entail?
Okay, so what we kind of have learned is that we're better off pushing the boundary a bit and trying to be a bit of ahead of the curve or trying to be, smarter than the rest, because we can't really afford, we're not big enough to just sit back and let things happen. We'll just get swallowed up. So, in fact, I was talking about this with the owner today. So it's just fortuitous that it came up. But as a business, we were talking about how we have innovated, and, innovation's a very broad term, but if you take publishing, and we consider ourselves fairly mainstream these days, and certainly in business, and so we consider the West Australian a competitor and the Financial Review a competitor. Things like doing events. We started doing that long before any of those guys. In fact, the West Australian poached our events manager to start up their events business. 40 Under 40, which is one of our most popular events. We're going into 19th year of it. That was something that, look, we didn't create that. We borrowed that from some friends of ours in another country who said, you should do this. But, we still innovated in this market. And then once we'd done events, we kept doing new ones and different ones. In 2005, we launched our first email newsletter, daily email newsletter. Now, you guys, that's just a common marketing tool these days. But when we launched that, the only one that was available to people in Perth from any real regular mainstream kind of news operation was the SMH. So you either got the Sydney Morning Herald News every day, which a lot of people did because that was available, or you waited for the paper in the morning. And we launched a daily on that, on the basis of, well, let's have a crack at this. In fact, the advertising guys came to me and said, that idea you guys talked about last year, we've sold the advertising on it. You need to start it in a month. So we went off and worked out how to do it. I honestly, I learned a lot from that process. I'd been a business journalist for 15 years at that stage. I knew that you could do a lot on the basis of checking various news sources like the ASX, and we paid for AAP, which is a news consolidator that all the publishers usually contribute to and pay to get stuff off. And most of your listeners or viewers will have read AAP copy somewhere. It's on loads of sites. But we just paid for that so that we had news from Canberra, and if there was something big in Western Australia in the courts or whatever, we didn't have the ability to go to do all that. And I just, I remember I did that daily news email for about 2 weeks on my own. Didn't send it to anyone, just sent it internally. And then we launched it to the public, and I ran it for about a month. And after I'd run it for a month and still had my day job, being editor of the newspaper, after a month I said, we can do this with just one person. So all the other journalists contributing to it, one person on deck, and that's how we worked out how to. We'd commercialised it, but that's how we worked out we could afford to do it.
Yeah, of course. What did the website look like then?
It's a bit clunky. Yeah, I found, I think I was like on a Wayback Machine or something the other day, and I stumbled on a page and I went, oh, wow, like a couple of little tiny familiar things. Like I'd almost forgotten what it looked like. But yeah, it was red and blue and white and had lots and lots of text stuff and not many pictures. And no, very, very different.
Did you publish your stories in the website then as well as the print magazine, or was it kind of like an advertisement for the print magazine?
So, and when I first arrived at Business News, the website was a bit of an afterthought. It would be, we would put it was a weekly newspaper, we'd put the content on there at some point or some of it.
Yeah.
And we would put up the odd daily sort of piece. If someone kind of went, oh, we should put that up, we'd put the odd thing up there just to keep the site alive. When we got to launching the email, we then became really much a daily site. I don't think the site changed much in look. Maybe it evolved slightly. And forgive me, I actually can't remember. It was really about, we'd just have its sort of 15 to 20 stories for the day there. And then really the focus was the email.
Yeah.
And the email was designed as a marketing tool. It was something to show the world that we existed. And what I did learn from that, which, this is really a media thing rather than a technology thing. What it did was it closed the gap for us in terms of credibility. So difficult to explain, but when you're a weekly newspaper, what you can't do is just publish stuff that happened. So we would go to press on Tuesday. You can't just publish stuff that happened on Tuesday and people get it on Thursday. It's old news. So you've got to go and get your own news. You've got to go and find it and dig it out. And so people would pick up this newspaper and go, well, this is interesting stuff, but it's not all the stuff I've read in the other minute. These guys, maybe they don't know that stuff. When we did the daily email at 4 o'clock, or probably in those days it was closer to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we delivered pretty much what everyone read the next day. And for a month when I did it, I only recall one story that the West Australian had that I knew I should have had. So one person pretty much. I'm not saying we wrote the stories beautifully or anything. They were, they were quickly turned around things, but the news that you should have, not the stuff you had to go and dig out, was there every day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And people went, oh, wow, these guys know their stuff.
Yeah.
The stuff that we're reading in the newspaper is extra.
Yeah.
And so that really gave us real credibility in the market.
So the newspaper was news they won't find anywhere else.
Correct.
And the newsletter covered that gap with the dailies.
And it made it seem more like something to pay for, because that was really, something different.
What does the beat of a business news journalist look like? How do you go out and find that news?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's quite broad. So I would say, in Western Australia, we have decided that the key areas to cover are obviously resources and property. They're just big, and property would be big in any market anywhere.
Yes.
And when I say resources, it's pretty broad brush. Oil and gas and mining and all the stuff that fits in underneath that, all the services. We cover community arts. We have that's a specific beat that someone covers, because we think not-for-profit is a major enterprise or industry in this town. And so there's 3 of those. We do deals. So funnily enough, mining and resources have lots of deals that happen. And we've almost got people who cover those almost separately sometimes. Sometimes it'll be the resources writer, sometimes it'll be someone else. And then we have professional services, which is, the accountants, the lawyers, the ICT professionals, all those service companies and how they interact with that. So they're quite big areas for us. So each of those are different in terms of where you get your news from. Mining a lot of it is from the ASX.
Yes.
They have to announce stuff first on the ASX, and there's 750 companies, maybe 750 companies in West Australia that are listed, maybe 550 resources companies. So there's a lot of news in there every day. Whereas if you go to community arts, it's much more about talking to people, getting out, going to events, relationships. Yeah. And mining's still relationships, don't get me wrong. It's still really important. And look, if you wanted a view on how journalism's changed in 30 years. Well, it's definitely, when I was just starting, the going to the pub and drinking until you got a story was just sort of dying out. Because I was one of the first, my last wave of cadets, they started employing university graduates and they were seeking something else. And funnily enough, the introduction of technology to newspapers, being colour, meant that the deadlines all came forward. So to get a colour photo set on a newspaper page meant that they had to get it to the stone, as they'd say, by 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So, we would have to be filing our stories anyway by 3.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had a black and white normal mono paper, you might be filing at 8 o'clock. So it's quite a lot of difference as that happened.
Wow, so that affects the drinking at the pub.
It absolutely, truly,
amazing, yeah.
it means you have to be at work at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's much more normal rather than turning up at midday.
Got a bit of a hangover.
Or going to lunch and then coming back, kind of writing a story and then going to the pub and getting another story for the next day.
Do you have any scoops that have stood out over your career?
Yeah, look, funnily enough, the most fun one was literally in my last few weeks when I was at the West Australian. I'd pretty much committed to join Business News, and I got a tip-off about the then police minister being involved in a scandal around finance broking. And look, I dug out enough detail to get that story going. It was front page. And of course, funnily enough in journalism, sometimes with stories like that, once you published enough, the phone call comes the next day. Oh, you didn't know this. And so I ended up having the front page of the West Australian 4 days out of 5. Right. Ended up going down to Albany and basically, it was a lot of fun. Me and a photographer, we ended up, convincing this guy that he had to sit down with us. And he did. Not the police minister, the finance broker who had been a cover-up. And anyway, the minister resigned.
Wow.
So, it felt like it was right.
Yeah.
And it was a dirty, grubby story, and not from my point, but from what was uncovered. Mm-hmm. So it was very satisfying.
That's a great way to go out.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. And it was kind of weird to then go to a little newspaper that was just trying to find its feet, and probably just we didn't write anything much like that for quite some time. But
I was going to ask, what does a Business News scoop look like?
Yeah, so more we are like getting ahead of a trend.
Yeah.
Like a really good example would be, and this one always resonated with me, we had a really interesting relationship with a lot of associations, right? They are big users of us, and we used to use them. We used to give them, special conditions, and then they would help us get to their members and that sort of thing. So it was synergistic. One of those associations sort of rang us up one time and said, look, we'd like to get all these engineers and architects and everyone in the room and do one of these. We used to do these lunches where you'd have a whole industry in a room and then you'd ask what the issues were. And they said, we should do one of these. We'll get all the people. And we said, great. So we had, 12 or 15 engineers or professionals in those sort of field. And I think it was about 2004, 2005. And they said, the big thing that came out of it was there's going to be a skill shortage. Mm-hmm. And we're like, skill shortage? What is it? That's an interesting term. Never heard that before. So we kind of floated this idea that there could be a skill shortage in WA. And I mean, you just watched it unfold after that. Yeah. It went nuts. And, all the stories of, by the end of it, you didn't even need a skill to have a shortage. It was a shortage of everything. And if you were a cleaner, you got paid ridiculous amount of money. But it started with the engineers and those kind of guys who they just got hoovered up by the big companies who were trying to build, trying to expand or create new mine sites or build new LNG plants. It was incredible. So that's a different kind of scoop. Yeah, you know what I mean? It's kind of like...
It's more forward-facing rather than historical.
Yeah. And it's much more satisfying. I mean, I remember we wrote a story about mumpreneurs. And, we went searching and eventually we found someone in America had used that term a year before we had. Yeah. And so we went, okay, we can't really claim it. And that term has just gone and gone and gone ever since, you know. So I do like that stuff. You know, it's different than, and we still do have the other kind of scoop, but scoops these days just don't last.
Yeah.
You know, if you get something online for our email at 4:00, it's there on everybody else's website pretty quickly. If it's a genuine scoop that people genuinely want to follow, it'll be out there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But the trends might fizzle out pretty quickly too. So I think, yeah,
The trends can last longer. I mean, mompreneur is still a thing.
it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The skills shortage is absolutely still a thing.
Well, everyone's been worried about it for so long. You know, and people have been trying to fix it.
So there's that awareness of it now, but it's more about giving people that information in a timely manner that they could consider doing something with it.
And
you know,
and when you are in business, being able to adapt quickly,
correct,
is, and especially in the current landscape, is incredibly important. So
I think it's always been important.
yeah,
It feels more like it now, but I think it's just always been like that. Being able to, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe because technology allows people to jump in on, and globalization allows people to jump in on your market quicker. You do need to be ready for it. So that's fair.
And now, a quick word from our sponsors.
Vision is our art form. Emotions are the narrative. And we believe boundaries are just stepping stones. Film my video, telling your story.
But how does WA or Western Australia stand in the whole global, agile, pivoting innovation sense anyway?
Yeah, so, you know, all the time people, you know, self-flagellate all the time about Western Australia and
Especially
how,
WA,
and how we do. And I think we've got this privileged position because we're a capital city and we're the capital of a really big state.
Yes.
You know, we represent a third of a country. We kind of get a bit ahead of ourselves, or we're not too big for our boots. I think we just have these expectations about ourselves that no one else has. And also we're wealthy, like, you know, really per capita.
Yes.
We have something that is, you know, 99% of the world would desire what we've got. Yeah. And part of that has created innovation, you know, for a long time. I mean, one of the first things that wealth brings is health. And our health industry and the health department and our hospitals and everything, they were, you know, in an advanced stage here from the 60s onwards. And our universities, you know, benefited as well. And you look back at medical technology and medical research, we've always been strong at it. And yet, where I was going to get to is, we're like this now, a state of 2.5 million people, a city of 2 million people. If you kind of look around the world and go, what city of 2 million people is a world leader in anything? Not, it's hard to name them, you know, like.
You're running off the top of my head.
And we all want to be Silicon Valley, which is, you know, like sort of right there of San Francisco. Silicon Valley probably has millions more people than we do. We want to be this hub, and we look at those places jealously, and yet we've got everything we would need here. And if you go and look at every industry that you can think of, we'll have someone here doing something, you know, edgy, if not global leader in it. It's just that we don't, well, of course we're not going to be a global leader in film. Hollywood's got that. We're not going to be a global leader in technology because Silicon Valley's got that. We're not going to be a global leader in medicine because, you know, Boston's got that. So, and I'm sure there's some English and French versions of each of those as well. Yeah. So, but what we can be is have, individual companies which produce world-leading, advanced stuff, and we have this world-leading mining industry which we do tap into and produce world-leading stuff. It's just that we don't celebrate it.
Do you think there is lots of innovation happening here that just people don't realize? It's just happening and slipping through the cracks.
So much of it, it's unbelievable. And I mean, you can graduate it or gradiate it or whatever you call it from that mineral stuff. Yeah. Where you got guys doing all sorts of incredible stuff from, just little stuff to make trains, iron ore trains, run 3% smoother, so that they use, 3% less energy, which is an enormous amount of fuel, which saves a lot of money. All that kind of stuff, the way, all those things, down through to, I was thinking about the other day, we did a piece a couple of years ago, sort of pre-Christmas piece on bicycle technology in WA. And it was just bizarre. You got those cyclic mobs that they're listed, and they do. I think they've got little cameras that fit on the front of bikes, and there was the guy's steady rack. So this guy's invented a really easy rack that you just roll your bike up to it, and chunk, you put your bike up on the wall. Now, last year he'd sold 100,000 of them.
Wow.
The whole Woodside buildings, all the ground floors kitted out with them. He sold 100,000 globally, not in WA. And there's some guys. I remember having a great chat with these guys who've worked out. They've worked out how to use cable and to pick up sound. And so you can do all sorts of stuff by just wherever there's a cable, they can monitor. So you can either put cable down and monitor the sound because it affects the light waves, or you can just listen to a cable that's running by road and work out traffic stuff and that's, now those guys could have been anywhere. And little black strips that you run over on the road, Metro count. Well, that guy has got half the world market in traffic counting. Right?
My confession is I had no idea what they were.
Oh, the dunks.
I drove a couple every day.
It's a piece of pipe, and when you drive over it, puts a puff of air out into a machine, right? And what he's done is, first of all, he worked out how to do that so it could tell it was a truck or a motorbike or a car, and how fast it was going. And then he got the software, and he developed the software. So over time, he now has all the analytics, and he has, because he gets it all back here, he's got all the global comparisons. And
what was that called again?
Metro count.
Metro count. So there you go. I
Yeah.
never even heard of that.
How do you know about these kind of things? Do they come to business news, or do you find them in some secret squirrel club?
It's a huge variety. Like that one, for one reason or another, I just stumbled over it. I think I went, do you know these guys or something? I can't remember. Whereas you might have other companies, especially listed ones, who've got public relations groups that shove stuff at you. And, and some like, Austal Ships, which is one of my favourites. There's the global leader in producing fast ferries. We're not talking about, little pleasure craft or anything. We're talking about 300-metre catamarans that take 300 cars in them, right?
Wow.
And 1,000 passengers and travel at 70 kilometres an hour on the water, right? So, and they're all designed here. They were all built here, but they mainly now, they build some here, but they build a lot offshore because of costs. Yeah. And they've shifted to the US, and they're one of the biggest suppliers to the US Navy, and they do defence vessels as well. Yeah. And it's all on. And this is the weird thing. The key technology there was aluminium welding. They just worked out how to weld aluminium better than anybody else had worked it out, because they're making cray boats here for the West Australian fishing industry, and they're small boats. They take a big battering in big seas, and they had to work out how to make them strong.
And light.
Because they had to get live lobster back quick. Yeah. They had to be light and fast, quite right.
Wow.
So, and they've just kept innovating. But what I was going to say is those guys, they're listed, they've got an army of people putting out press stuff about themselves. So, you don't, but originally they didn't, and over time, you drive down south at what's now Henderson, which was barely existed when those guys were down there back in the late 80s and early 90s. What are those guys doing? What's that? That's a big boat. Yeah. Who's building that? And there's still people like that down there. I've been down there and seen enormous boats built that you go, there's no company has ever put a press release out over. Yeah. And you go, it's amazing. It's quite an industry down there, actually.
I actually worked in a data centre down there, so there you go.
Well, you would have seen all the ships.
Yeah, constantly, yeah. You must get frustrated with people then who say things like, nothing ever happens in Perth, or they say something like, wait a while, these kind of things. And you're right at the forefront of, well, not the forefront, but all of this news is coming to you. You're seeing it all.
Yeah, look, I agree. I do get frustrated. I get frustrated by that view. Look, I don't know the flip side of that view is, oh, we're the best, and rah, rah. And I mean, we're not that either, right? We're just. I think the expression is we punch above our weight, and I think we do. Yeah. And I think for a city of 2 million people in the middle of nowhere, we have all these amazing things going for us. We have health institutes doing medical research that is actually breakthrough stuff, and there's a bunch of reasons for that, which are half I explained, but you got some really smart people that did some stuff years ago that starts to pay off. But there is a little bit of me that gets, it's you don't want it to be a secret, you don't want to overcook it. I think it's probably too much of a secret, and I think that does make it difficult. So personally, I believe we do need to promote Perth more, because I think sometimes people don't think about investing here because they think, oh, well, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the skills, or they only do mining, or they only dig stuff up, or it's too expensive. And I think all those things are not true.
And what about, as a media guy, do you see it problematic that news organisations are pulling out of Perth and operating entirely from New South Wales and Victoria? Is that going to negatively affect us reporting these kind of stories in the next decade?
Because you lose the boots on the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we have business news, but...
Oh, no. I think, obviously some of that plays into, that's a benefit to me to a degree, because that gives us a market to ourselves. Yeah. But overall, I think it's disappointing. It does mean that, and if you take like that more those national news things, it means that potentially someone's making a decision in Sydney about what's news over here and doesn't get it. Yeah. It does mean that you won't have certain resources here, but I do think it's partly where it's disappointing is it will be stuff about Perth won't be played out, won't be told about Perth to Perth people. Yeah. But I think that's broad. It's broader than that. I mean, you tell me. Have you guys got subscriptions to the New York Times?
Yes, I do.
Okay, right. So there's no way on earth anyone when I was your age that anyone would have had that. I mean, you had to. It would have been $7 a day to get something that was 3 weeks old delivered to you, and you went to the library to go and have a look at the back issues if you were desperately interested. So the danger with that is, because you either you're free or you're paid, it doesn't really matter, because in whichever way you're being monetized, you've expanded your universe, and that's fine. But it also means that what I find is that news over in America is now as big a news as news that happens here. Yeah. People know more about Donald Trump than they know about Scott Morrison. Yeah, and I've heard people have arguments in pubs. Who would you vote for, Biden or Trump? They can't vote for either, right? They're not American. And there's no way that conversation was had 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
That's so true. I've never actually thought of it that way. It just seems obvious that such big news that we would all, but without this ever-present news force.
Because that's where the journalists are, and they're the last ones standing, because, good on the New York Times, but it's worked out that it's no longer, printing 750,000 copies for a market of 5 to 10 million, or it's probably 20 million. They're now got a market they've got 6 million subscribers in a global market, and I don't know what their local print publication would be, 100,000, or it'd probably be less than what the West Australian prints. I mean, that's quite possible. I don't know the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised. So, that's changed. And what that means is so you're right. So it's not just news, it's all content is much more skewed to the global centre.
It's centralising around these big population areas, and so smaller news in smaller areas is getting lost in the noise.
Correct, because no matter how good the West Australian got at digital news, no one in New York would be interested.
Yeah, that's true.
They're not going to go, oh, did you see that thing about McGowan and Harvey battling it out in the debate? I mean, they're just not going to, are they?
Although they did see him, what did he do? Read the letter to the...
to the Easter Bunny. Or
the Easter Bunny story. That went everywhere, because I saw that on Reddit, and that went international. So he got that one.
So he got one, whereas Trump gets every day, 5 times a day.
Yeah. The way he gets them, I'm glad McGowan's not
Yeah.
Not paralleling Trump. Wow.
No, I'm fine with that. But and look, there's no doubt that right now, I think more than ever, the US is important to us, and there's all sorts of, global, change taking place, and we've got to be very careful and very wary of it. But those kind of things have happened before, and there's no way that the front page of the West Australian in the 1960s was all about Lyndon Johnston, and it just wasn't like that.
There's a scary parallel with the scoop you told us about before. Would that kind of scoop happen now without that local attention?
So that's the danger.
Yeah.
That is the danger. And if you get back to, we continue talking about the media, journalists have a lot of other stuff at their disposal. So there are lots of mechanisms to find out stuff that didn't exist 20 years ago, right? So, and in fact, so when I started at the West Australian, the business section, the older senior journalists would say, Mark, you've got to go down to it wasn't ASEC back then, it was whatever it was, the securities, something or other, I can't remember. And I had to go down, they'd write down the company name or the person name and on a piece of paper, and I'd go down and go and look up microfiche, physical microfiche, go through, request some prints, and I learned over time that when I came back with these prints, they'd say, oh, well, now you need to go and chase that. So I learned over time the tracing technique so I could get more information and I have to go backwards and forwards up and down the terrace. So nowadays, you just, for a very small fee, you just tap in and get all that stuff. It's a lot. And, and then, looking up town planning stuff on local council sites. So the journalist, even though there's less of them, an experienced journalist has a lot of things at their disposal that they can achieve in a shorter time period without leaving their desk.
So a lot of that intelligence gathering is now automated and online.
Digital.
And,
Less travel time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely all that. So that's a plus, and you can come up with a fabulous story without interviewing anybody, just based on, well, here's the data, and we do it all the time. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just...
Is there a risk of, second, third-hand information from the internet, as opposed to going to the source, talking to someone that is part of the story?
Oh, look, if it's a particularly damning story, you always want to go and check it. So don't get me wrong, but it depends on the source. And I'm talking about, we pull a lot of data. So our subscription model is based on data. People pay for us. They're not really buying the news. They're 50% news, 50% data.
The BNIQ is quite popular.
Yeah. So that data and insights, as we call it now, is what a lot of people want because that's really hard to get. And that's,
especially in Perth.
Absolutely right. And again, you talk about globalization or nationalization. You can get all that data on the top 200 listed companies in Australia and the top 250 private companies in Western Australia. In Australia. But in WA, that'll represent 20 companies or 15 companies. That's not a lot to go on. Whereas we obviously go underneath that and do 200 of each or whatever or more here. But the point I was going to make is if you want to look at how, who's the best paid CEO or who's the best value CEO, who's the worst, those are, as long as you're sure of your data coming from annual reports, you can come up with some fabulous stories, and you don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to ask the guy or her if she feels that her salary is justified. You just print that there's the top 5 and there's the bottom, and here's the ones that perform the best and here's the ones that perform the worst. It's literally, it's just
all that data's
matter of fact.
Yeah, just facts. This is how it should be.
But it's good. There's still good journalism around it, right? It's still got to be written well and interestingly.
And that would be a fun question to ask a lot of people, right? Do you think your salary is justified? I'm sure they all do.
Well, they're all trained in a non-answer, so it's a pointless exercise, in my view.
Yeah. Although, aren't most journalists trained in the art of question kung fu, where you counter their misdirection with another question?
Trained is a strong word.
Okay.
It's a learned activity. I don't recall anyone ever training anybody on that stuff. You're either, you learn it from experience, and you're either good at it or you're not.
Yeah. Do you think you're good at it?
I'm okay at it. And I think back in the day, I think there are different types of journalists. There are journalists who like being part of the story. I think that's probably more of a broadcast thing, to be honest. Mm-hmm. They've got the camera on them and they're asking the hard question. And that was never me. I'm a print journalist. I was happy to ask the hard question in private. I was happy to ask it over the phone or whatever. But it was pretty satisfying when you got and someone knows that's it, they're done. Yeah. And you kind of go, well, you're only asking. And I love pursuing things where I felt people were getting ripped off, people were losing money. And that's quite satisfying. And again, there are people who love the gotcha moment, but it's just gotcha for the sake of gotcha. Yeah. And they get somebody who's done a perfectly good job, but slips up and makes a stupid comment or whatever. So we've never been like that. So, and I do think there is a difference. Politics is a lot more of that. Getting someone to slip and say something on camera is like, okay, well, let's look at the policy. We'd prefer to look at the policy track record and how they perform, because we don't think how someone performs in front of a camera should be the basis for, running a country or running a state. But, nevertheless, it's all good television and we all watch it when it happens.
Yeah. It's good drama.
And we like watching politicians make gaffes. I mean,
we do.
It's fun. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's Schadenfreude, right? We prefer it happens to someone else.
Absolutely.
I like watching train wrecks and stuff, I guess, in slow motion. Yeah.
And now a quick word from our sponsors.
We believe that you can create art and beauty with technology. We think big. We move quietly. We are Ninja Software.
Just a quick question on the back to the New York Times thing on the global reach stuff. So I think with the internet today, running news and journalism is like this big black hole of the internet now. And now there's, in the marketing side of things and advertising, everyone's really pushing the social media, and advertising through that. So what are your thoughts on the more traditional advertising versus the new cool social media stuff?
So personally, I think that wave has kind of it's pushed as hard as it can, and it's receding. It's peaked, yeah. So, and I really noticed it probably in Western Australia 4 or 5 years ago when things were particularly tight as well here economically. The marketing decisions a lot of those people had been fired, made redundant, and the decision making had been shifted to someone who was, and I'm going to be a little bit stereotypy here, but they'd be in their mid-20s. They were doing something else in the business, but they knew something about social media, so they became the decision maker. And they brought to the table some stuff that, hey, look, we've got this, look at that. And it was exciting. We operate in a B2B space. So, our advertisers and people using us typically are looking for business customers. So I think in a bad time when no one's winning any business, the fact that you've got more likes on Facebook or whatever might look good. How that wins you business is a little bit more mysterious to me. So I think what's happened is people have learned, there's always this saturation effect, right? If you're the first to do something, you're going to get, Facebook advertising, and prior to that, getting position on Google accurately was cheap. And if you were the first, so it's cheap if you were the first because no one else was doing it, and you were first, so you got the benefit of it, especially if you're in products that people were looking to buy in that way. So those stories become the stories that everyone hears. But over time, when everyone's using it, then it's not cheap. To be positioned right is expensive. And then in certain, areas, if you're selling mining services to mining executives, you're just not going to get it find it in the same way. No. So I feel like that story's kind of, like I say, that it's ebbed, the tide's ebbed, it's gone back out. I'm not saying it goes all the way back out and disappears. The history of media doesn't show that. The history of media shows papers gave way, gave away market share to radio, and then they collectively gave away market share to television, and that collectively gave away market share to the internet, which collectively has given away market share to social media in particular. So, we'll all live with each other and use each other. But I do think that traditional media, there's no doubt that traditional media in terms of advertising, and I'm even talking about print advertising, still has a place. We've been talking about when are we going to kill off our magazine or our newspaper for the last 15 years. And it still represents a significant and sometimes growth sector for us.
So my confession is I read the magazine, I don't read the website. And I'm a millennial.
That's fine. It's fine. You're allowed to be unusual.
I just find the magazine is somewhere where I read it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like books and ebooks, right? Where everyone thought ebooks would kill books. But
the internet, I have, and like I said, I have a New York Times subscription, I have a Wall Street Journal subscription. I'm on Reddit. Actually don't go on much social media, but there's so many things vying for my attention. But the magazine sits there, on the table, or sometimes in the toilet. It's somewhere where I'm going to read it.
Look, they're designed. I'm not dissimilar to you. I read the newspaper in the morning because that's just always been a habit, and I just really struggle. I like the way it's structured. Someone has made an effort to put it in this structure and put that story there, and when you get online, it's not the same world. Having said that, I use our email in the afternoon, and I flick through that, and I do use the email as a source.
I like the email,
and I'll click on. I'll do what everybody does. I mean, when I look at our statistics, the website statistics, they reflect exactly my habit. That most people click on 2 stories.
Yes,
they click on a story, they read it, even on their phone, and then they come back to the email. They scroll further down, they go to the next one.
Isn't that interesting?
And that email is curated. So it's in an order that our editor has decided is the best for someone who's doing business in Western Australia. It's not bespoke. And I guess that's the next phase of probably what we're doing and others are already doing, where you would generate an email that's more for you. We're not there yet, but
you need a software company to help you win on.
Yeah.
Got it. Ninja.
Customer intelligence is something I believe that is a wave that's going to hit in the next 2 to 5 years.
Yeah. And I mean, it has been hitting already, hasn't it? But it's going to get right down to everybody can access it, right?
Well, the data sets have been figured out, and the tech to process it has been figured out. And now it's just that final last consumer leg of selling it to businesses.
Yes, okay.
That's my theory. And that's exactly what you want it for, is that individualized
like a recommendation engine
that you don't need a human processing, which is...
I mean, it works for Netflix, so it must work for news as well.
Google,
YouTube does it all already.
Yeah. Facebook's ruining the world with it. It's...
You can use it for good or
the big companies are doing it, and I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see the smaller companies.
And I kind of found out today a little bit, we had a good discussion with a group around Google, and, to get your Google Analytics for free, and then the next step up is $150,000 a year. Exactly. So, and to me, you're right, somewhere in between, someone's going to create the $20 and $30 and $50 and $70 versions of that, $70,000 versions that fit each part of the market. And that's when it becomes accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. And newsletters is the obvious,
tailoring and
because every time one of your readers clicks that article, you can say, well, that's the kind of news they like.
Yeah, and we do know that. We can see it,
obvious,
but we haven't yet automatically generated it yet.
But there's always the downside that we talk about, not getting enough Perth news out there because of centralization, but this kind of automatic data curation means a lot of news will go missed as well. So it's
correct. And that something won't be worth writing because, no one's ever clicked on that. And then someone is in business in WA, and we do find that we're a general public. I mean, our rule of thumb is the resources guys say, oh, you've got too much other stuff. And all the people who are not in resources go, you've got too much resources. And we reckon that's the balance.
Yeah, I think so.
The minute we're too much of, people go, oh, you're great, you've got plenty of resources, and that means the other people are not going to be satisfied. And I do think that it doesn't matter if you're in mining or ICT or whatever, you want to see the full breadth of what's going on in this state.
What would be nice, from our perspective, is the overlap with those industries, because it's people get so caught up with resource sector, but most of us are in some way supplying the resource sector. So
I think that's there's two elements to that. First of all, that whatever you can ultimately do for the resource sector usually is something you can then incrementally go somewhere else. And I think that the resource sector is, like every other industry, trying to learn from everybody else. Yeah. So our view is, if you write a story about someone who's, done something in hospitality and made some HR changes or whatever, they can consider applying that in their sector. We believe that people read our articles because they're trying to learn from other sectors. So there's a bit of both, right? So someone's got and in fact, I had a really interesting discussion with some guys at a really interesting business called Airscope. You can go and have a look at it. I mean, seriously, it's fascinating. You know them, or?
We built their software.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay.
Yeah.
So
they've gone in-house now, but we
had a good partnership.
Yeah, we're a technology company that provided their first software. So
well, there you go. And but they're all focused on oil and gas right now, but they can see that it's not just about that. It's facilities anywhere. And they've got I think a parallel story in a way. There's another firm that's just listed on the stock market here called Doug, which is Down Under Geosystems, all right?
Familiar with them.
Familiar with them. I mean, you're talking about innovation, right?
Yeah.
They're doing cool things.
I mean, they're amazing. And they've got the biggest private supercomputer in the Southern Hemisphere, in West Perth. And they've got a bigger one than that in Houston. And they're putting one in London, I think. And they've worked out how to stick a server in oil. Yeah. And that's the trick. And that's how you do the heat dissipation, and you can run servers at way more intensity and blah, 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 or energy efficiently, and therefore put them all together. I mean, they're really clever guys.
They've got a great story too. I think they did that. They experimented with that because they had no alternative. They were overheating.
I regret that I know the... I know the guy. I met the guy who runs the business and owns the business. Met him years ago when he was just starting. He's a very interesting guy, but I've never got to see it. Some of the other journalists, I do make an effort to go and sneak in and see these things and meet these people, because I find it really fascinating. And again, that's why I just think there's so much going on, because I just struggle to believe that these kind of businesses, there's so many of them in every city in the world. I don't believe that. I think there's a lot here because we're wealthy and we can do it, and those guys have got enough money, and there is a big industry like oil and gas there that can spend money and will spend enough that these guys can experiment and find out if they can do it. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it is. One question I wanted to ask you is, we talked about trends before. Where do you see Perth going in the next 10 to 20 years?
So that's a really difficult question, because I think, I think probably where I didn't answer your previous questions is, it's not so much that we, self-flagellate, as I said, or that other people don't think we're important. It's that I think sometimes we don't, as a community, capitalise on it. So I don't think government shows great leadership in this area. I think other states, for instance, just have, maybe because they need to, are better at doing it. And it's funny that the South Australias and bless Victoria right now, but generally speaking, they steal other people's events and they really try and shape their state. And I'm very laissez-faire, and I do believe in, that governments shouldn't be trying to pick winners, but I do think that governments should be trying to say, well, we should be making it easier for anyone to innovate and rah. And I don't think they do that. They pay lip service to it, but I don't think they do it. I think, generally speaking, if we have a problem here, it's that government is made lazy because it's got a lot of money coming in. It doesn't have to work hard for it. And you see that in the worst of times, even in these downturns, there's not people starving on the streets, and no one freezes to death in Perth in winter. It's not that kind of place. So the shape of Perth over the next 10, 15, 20 years, I think, is guided by can someone take some ownership? And I think there's a bit of that happening. I think we've seen some serious private leaders, like you've got Adrian Fini, who's pushed really hard in areas like heritage building, reconstruction and refurbishment, and trying to get areas of Perth to be more livable or more comfortable for people to be in, because he sees that as valuable to the state, and I agree with him.
Yeah.
And you've got, Twiggy Forrest, again, bless him, but he's trying to do stuff that I think, he's trying to make some areas of Perth and WA better than they were. And I just, it's interesting that it's being driven by private people more than government. I think that's been a bit of a constant. There's been some times in our state's history where government has driven it, and I think people point to Sir Charles Court and that period as a time when, he pushed for the gas to be developed and the North West Shelf. And he's got plenty of critics out there. Don't you worry that he was geared towards big foreign companies to do stuff rather than local people and all that. You can go on about that stuff, but things happened, and a lot of what we're benefiting from happened from good decisions in those days. So I think something's happening there where I think Perth might be able to get this identity and be able to sell itself. And to be honest with you, COVID's helped a lot in that way. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but all the people who have thought, Perth, why would I go back there, are suddenly going, how quickly can I get back there?
Yeah.
And all the people who've come back have gone, oh, crikey, this isn't as bad as I thought it was. And
or as I remembered.
But part of it is safety, and I don't think the world's going to get any easier to live in. I mean, pandemic or not, the fact that 2 journalists have just been booted out of China does say to me that just our freedom of movement, our freedom of doing business, our freedom to just do whatever we want that we've kind of enjoyed really well for the last 30, 40 years is just starting to wane a bit. And I think I think Perth's opportunities and WA's opportunities to sell ourselves a bit as a safe haven, good place to do business, good place to come and do stuff.
The place you want to do business and raise your kids.
Absolutely. We're not going to be the holiday capital. I mean, people aren't going to fly. Most people are not. Only people who fly 16 hours go on holiday is people from here. Yeah. No one else does that, So it's family and friends, yes, investment, trade, those reasons to come here, those reasons to invest in here, and, settle. And I'm fine with that. I reckon that's pretty good. And if we can sell that, and that would have sounded mundane and a little bit boring just a year ago, now it sounds all right. Oh, yeah, that's okay.
Pretty good,
yeah. We all feel a bit lucky.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
We are lucky. I think Perth has definitely shown itself to be a great place to be in 2020, which there's not many of those. So,
no. But, there's that expression, you make your own luck. And I think the people who are here and live here mainly have chosen to live here.
Yes.
Because it is nice.
Yeah.
So how does all that fit in with something like the Bureau?
So, I mean, again, that's... we've got a couple of things that I think are very similar in that mode, but the Bureau is an idea where and this comes back to the whole consolidation of media thing as well. You talked about media leaving here. Well, if no one's here, who's ever going to write that story? And in the old days, even the New York Times had stringers that used to be here, or they would come wandering through and write about Perth. Those people are disappearing because we're just reading about Trump and what's happening in New York, right? Yeah. So we do have to produce, I think, that kind of content about our place. So, we've been pitching that for a while, private industry to government, that, we need some people here who write stories about Perth that anybody can use anywhere else. And it's business stories, but it's about the sexy, interesting things we do. It's the wine industry, it's the science, the medical research.
Best horizon in the world.
Absolutely. It's the innovation, So so if someone reads that in the Thailand newspaper or some website in India, they go, oh, okay, things are happening there. Oh, I might send my kids to go and study at university there. All those reasons. And similarly, that we talk about promoting Perth. Well, we've personally got an idea around that we're kind of trying to serialise next year, we think, so that, we can help give people a kind of cheat sheet of, if you find yourself travelling somewhere and someone asks you, Perth, why? Then you've got the answers. Now, no one's travelling anywhere in the near future. So at the moment, that series is a little bit, but I think eventually it still has its place, and and I think we can still tell our story on Zoom, and we can still tell it via the bureau through articles. So, the examples out there are the AFL has 30 journalists writing about AFL. And they just produce this stuff and anybody can use it. Now, they got themselves in a bit of strife recently because one of the journalists got suspended for writing a story the AFL didn't like. So you've got to have editorial standards when you write this stuff. You've got to be able to say the funder of this doesn't get the right to say what's being written. Not beyond it's this kind of stuff. They can't say yay or nay to stories. Otherwise, that's just propaganda. And we're not interested. We don't need propaganda for Western Australia. The place is fine. We don't need to hide anything. And that's the fun of it, that we just need to tell people what's here. So yeah, that's the key to that, which I think fits in with quite a lot of the narrative that we've been talking about in this interview.
Brilliant. So what's the timeline looking like for the Bureau to really hit its stride?
Well, that requires some people to back it. We've had a go at the state government, and we did a market-led proposal, one of the first ones to take advantage of that idea. And one of the things you learn when you're the first is that afterwards they go, we don't think it's worked very well, we're going to change it. So that was a bit disappointing because we didn't get anything. But we're currently pitching to the national government, and we've got some industry people who are kind of saying, well, if they don't do it, maybe we can back it. It's just the industry will tend to be on a shorter time frame. It's really hard to set up a business on the basis of, 1 or 2 years funding. You really need 3 to 5.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge. But if we got that going, I think it'd be pretty exciting. And, it worked. The South Australians do it. So there you go. The South Australians already have this in action, and they've had it for 5 or 6 years.
Well, we got beaten by South Australia.
Oh, no, we're innovators. We have totally taken their idea. Totally taken it. Not taken it. They offered it, the guys that do it are friends of ours in the media, and they've said, you should do this in WA. Yeah. And so we are trying our best.
And how do we find the South Australian?
It's called The Lead.
The Lead. Okay, great.
thelead.com.au.
Excellent.
It's very simple. It's a pretty good site, actually. And if you had your own website, you want to take a story from that and republish it, copyright. It's Creative Commons.
Oh, wow.
That's the point. As long as you don't have to, you can do anything with it you want. You don't have to, it's there to be used as you want.
Which is why you need a benefactor, because
Correct. There's no commercial, you can't sell any advertising on it.
Yeah.
No one's paying for it.
Yeah.
It isn't propaganda because the government or whoever's funding it is not telling you what to say beyond some restrictions around, well, we want you to write this type of thing in these sorts of sectors. And I think that's what a benefactor gets. And I reckon it works. Anyway, the South Australians have done pretty well. They pretty much own the space industry in Australia. Yeah. And, you look back and all this stuff's written about the space industry around the world, all these stories, and they're all written by The Lead. And it all says, the South, the space industry based in South Australia. Yeah. It's pretty simple.
Yeah. Yeah. We always end with a whimsical question. So,
right.
So the question is...
Off the cuff.
Off the cuff. I don't know how familiar you are with wrestling, boxing, MMA, but the fighters always have their intro music.
Yeah, okay.
They walk into the room, the lights go down, the music starts. What's your intro music?
Okay, you got me on the spot there. And so, I don't know, is it Tom Petty Free Falling, which I really love, or is it Hunters and Collectors and Shed Your Skin and Let's Get Started? I'm just not quite sure. I kind of go,
the second one.
I like, one's Aussie and one's not. One has a bit more of the time in my life that they're both pretty important to me. Nice. So, you can take your pick. How's that? But I'll go with the Hunters and Collectors because I particularly like the lyrics in that.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great answer and quick too.
Yeah, quick. That was very quick.
That's usually our gotcha.
I thought you had got me then. I was going, no, I don't normally equip myself around remembering,
Someone actually turned it around back on me once and I went, I don't know. I probably should have prepared.
Yeah, I always say. The problem is someone will ask me that in 5 years' time. I was like, I'll name something else. And they go, but you said. So.
I think it's a dynamic thing. You can change it every year.
You think?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks, mate.
It was a real pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
A great conversation. And it's nice to meet people who are optimistic about Perth, who actually are across everything that's happening here. So
No, I appreciate it. I'm very lucky. Journalists are lucky. They get to open the door and have a look at a whole lot of things that the rest of the world doesn't get a chance to see. So, I've been a bit lucky and privileged, I'd say.
we've been privileged to talk to you today. So
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it.
that's it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please tune in next week.